Hi everyone, welcome back to the Gamasutra Twitch channel. My name is Bryant Francis. I am not the mysterious voice inside your head for once. I am down here at the bottom of the screen, but I'm still very small. But above me, I have two wonderful giant faces gazing out from the abyss. One of these giant faces is Chris Graft. Say hi, Chris.
Hi, I have a pretty giant face to go with my giant head, even in real life.
You do.
So this is not an optical illusion.
Chris, what does your giant head do? Why are you here?
I am editor-in-chief of Gamasutra.
Sweet. And Ian, could you please introduce yourself and what you do and what game you made and why you're here?
I'm Dallas. I'm the creative director at Giant Sparrow, and our first game was The Unfinished Swan, and our second game, which came out last week, is What Remains of Edith Finch.
Right on. So as you may have noticed, even though it says we're playing What Remains of Edith Finch, we are not playing What Remains of Edith Finch because we are trying to do a justice to you all who have not played the game yet, because it's a really awesome interactive story. It does a really cool job navigating things with text and control and play, and Chris and I had a long conversation about this, and we could not think of any proper way to stream the game without just completely ruining that first chance for you to get your hands on the controls. So first off, I'm going to show you this. Oops, okay, that didn't go well over the here. It's going to move down here. The spoilers. I'll be keeping this up whenever we're talking about spoilers for the game. So if you want to hang around and learn about that, you have been forewarned. When we're not talking about it, I will turn it off. But know that it's a really interesting game. It's really fascinating. I think my take is that it does more things with using a controller to guide a player through like this first-person narrative than any other game I've seen. So congrats, Ian, to you and your team for making something really cool. That's your warning. That's your one warning. You get that, and you get the spoiler text after. That's it.
You went with the Comic Sans. I'm impressed.
I did.
It's bold.
I would have gone with Comic Sans bold, but I didn't know how to do it.
Yeah. So Ian, you had mentioned Unfinished Swan, but can you give us a little bit more about your background in game development? I mean, Unfinished Swan, that was a student game, right?
Well, it started off as a student prototype. So okay. I was in grad school at USC, and I was making these little, kind of 1 week prototypes, and one of them was the paint splatting mechanic, which ended up becoming the Unfinished Swan. But then, after I showed it at some festivals, I talked to Sony, and we set up a publishing deal. And then, it took us the next 3 years, and a team of 10 folks or so to make it.
Yeah. So if anybody who's watching now or watching it later hasn't played the Unfinished Swan, it's another Giant Sparrow game that you need to check out. And the mechanic is you throw lots of paint against a completely white space, and then it starts to reveal the geometry of the world. Another storytelling game. Yeah.
Ian, could you do me a favor? I've tried to explain this game to my girlfriend. I've tried to explain it to people who have not even heard of it, and I'm having a hard time. For the spoiler-free version, so I don't have to put my spoiler warning up, could you please explain what the game is and why you wanted to make this game?
Sure. You're talking about What Remains of Edith Finch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So What Remains of Edith Finch is a collection of short stories about a cursed family in Washington State, and you play as Edith coming back to the house that she grew up in. Everyone in her family has died, and she is exploring the house and trying to figure out why she is the last one left alive. And inside of each of the bedrooms, you'll find a different story about how that family member has died, and you'll get to kind of play out those stories as interactive bits and become those people for a time.
I'm actually really thrilled that you're calling it a collection of short stories, because I've had this thought in my head for a few years now, which is that I would love more games that took inspiration from short stories and short story formats. I'm actually really enjoying just like grabbing a short story bundle on Kindle and reading a bunch of different authors and a bunch of different slices. And I agree with, and I know I'm agreeing with the person who made it and defines it. So it's weird, but I completely get why you're calling it a short story, sort of a set of short stories, because not only does each segment, spoilers, not only do they all play from those different perspectives, but they also play completely differently than Edith's perspective as she wanders through the house.
one of the reasons I think that I'm really sensitive about revealing too.
Uh-oh. Chris just vanished. Chris just vanished. His mic is gone. We can't hear
Or he's
him.
just lost the words. He's been rendered speechless.
Your game has rendered Chris speechless. He's going to fix that, so I'll take a punt. So, Ian, my first question then for myself is, how did you begin thinking about the different ways of controlling Edith's family members for this game? Because Edith is walking through the house through first person. She can interact with objects, but most of her family members aren't. A handful are. Right. Some are literally only there. One's only there in animated form. But then sometimes they take on completely different art styles to get through the game.
I mean, the jumping off point for the whole game was really the sublime, like trying to create these moments that simultaneously evoked, like these feelings of, appreciation for beauty, but also, kind of ominous tone to it as well. So that kind of these sort of contradictory elements that I think are a key part of the sublime, of something that is, beautiful, but also overwhelming. And so initially, when I was thinking about my own life, the thing that really stood out to me was scuba diving. Growing up in Washington State and spending a lot of time, kind of at the bottom of the ocean, poking around at stuff, and what it looks like to see the bottom of the ocean kind of slope away into seemingly infinite darkness, and that kind of simultaneously being awed by the beauty of it, but also feeling very small and fragile. And, so in terms of how we went about, figuring out the controls for all these things and the stories, really just started, each story was kind of a kernel of, like a moment that sort of evoked something for us. So the very first thing we did on this was to make a scuba diving simulator and kind of play around with what it might feel like to be scuba diving. And, ultimately that's something that, mostly went away. There's a little trace of it, like in Molly's story as the shark. But, for example, in Calvin's story, that was a little, that's kind of the simplest story really that we have. And that was just what does it feel like to be on a swing set? And so then, the controls and what the player is actually doing kind of arose out of that desire to basically starting with a feeling of what does it feel like to be a kid on a swing set? What do we remember? How do we kind of embody that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was saying earlier is, I'm particularly sensitive to spoilers because I think one of the reasons I enjoyed this game so much, because I went into it and I had no idea what this game was about. I managed to avoid any of the demos that were going on and anything that anybody wrote. So when I play that,
to avoid me spending 3 years trying desperately to reach you to tell you about the game. Somehow
I am here for you now.
Chris ignored every PR email.
It's like a potential conflict though, and I think we ran into the same thing on Unfinished Swan, where the game is about the unknown. Unfinished Swan, especially, it's a white world, and this game too is about what it feels like to confront things that you don't understand. And there's this kind of challenge, how do we tell people about this game without ruining what makes it special? And I think our feeling was on Unfinished Swan, we did ourselves a disservice by not telling people anything, and then people come into the game expecting that it's a puzzle game or all these things that it's not, and they're kind of frustrated that we didn't get the game that they wanted. So this time around, we sort of took the opposite approach and we'll just show everything we can and trust that people like Chris who don't want to hear about it can kind of tune out. But it's really challenging to try to tell people about a game where it works best if they know nothing.
Yeah. That's such a weird marketing challenge for you, because even earlier on when you were telling Bryant what the game's about, it's a series of short stories about this family, and then I think a lot of people might hear, and of course there's influence from other environmental storytelling games like Gone Home. But this takes that further with the game mechanics and the interactions in regards to storytelling, I feel like. So it's just hard to explain to somebody. It's putting that very first one where you're the hungry girl at the beginning, at the start.
That freaked me out so much. Just gonna say that.
It felt like I was just reading some kind of like weird tale by like whether it's like Bradbury or Lovecraftian like thing, but it was like played out and I was in it, and I love those kinds of stories and the fact that you're able to convey that. So let me try to twist this into an actual question instead of me just ranting about how good this is. I guess we can start with how does the story writing process work in something like this, and how do you weave that into the game mechanics and developing those?
Yeah, I think it's a similar answer to what we were just talking about earlier, where everything starts with something very concrete, like a feeling of what it's like to be on a swing set. Because as a developer, like we're inherently interested in making things that we've never seen before. So it's really hard for us to, or for me, like, starting off with these stories, to describe it to other people, because, there aren't a lot of touchstones. And even I like don't really know what it is that I want. Like, I have like a kind of general sense, but, it helps to start from a very specific place. Like you can talk to an animator, or you can talk to a gameplay programmer and say like, okay, we want it to feel like you're a child on a swing set, and they have like something to work with. So, and that's, I think, historically been the most difficult part of all of these stories is, coming up with what the player is doing moment to moment, and like, how does that interaction feel? So that's usually where we start. Is something, around kind of like a verb, like flying a kite, for example. Like, I remember flying a kite on the beach as something, like from my childhood. So, we just did a bunch of like kite flying prototypes. And the story part of it, like, what the dialogue is, who the characters are, like how this is embedded in a larger world, is something that kind of comes after the fact. Like after we figure out what's interesting to us from just like a purely interactive standpoint. And then what can we do also? It's like, what is the game engine and the staff we have, and the things we've already made, like what does that kind of facilitate? And then, we get like a sense of it, and then we kind of write the story to fit around what has already kind of started sprouting up. So we try to, essentially like work with the grain, where we're always writing to what we have, or, in some cases, like trying to address the problems that are already becoming apparent. Of like, oh, players don't really understand this, or they don't care about that, or whatever it is. Like I think in Edith's case, for the kind of meta narrative that's connecting these stories, that was even more true, where we couldn't really write that story until all of the other stories were kind of done, and we had a sense of like what the player was going to feel like after each of these stories. And there's a question of not only the individual stories, but also like once you string these things together, you get a very different reaction from players. So we spent a long time just playtesting individual stories, where they're like 5 or 15-minute playtests or whatever. But after maybe 2 years of development, we kind of had most of the stories together, and we could see people play through all of them together. And we found like, oh yeah, after you play like 2 of these stories, players start to get the sense of, oh, everyone's going to die. And so each time they start a story, they come into it with a very different set of expectations. And the feeling is just very different. So again, I think the short answer is we work backwards in terms of the story, where we just try to get like all of the, kind of pieces in place, and then make a story that kind of speaks to what it is that we've been able to make.
So that's interesting. Like you describe it as backwards, but a lot of game developers would describe that as like that. That's how I've heard both ways. Is what I'm saying. Like the story comes up first, and then they make the game around that. But it's just interesting in the case of your game. So basically, you take a nice feeling that you had as a child, and then you're thinking, now how can you die from that? like kind of how it is.
One of the things that we looked at was Twilight Zone in terms of anthology series that worked pretty well. And so obviously, the more memorable ending or memorable episodes of the Twilight Zone tend to have really strong endings. So that was certainly one of the first things that, as soon as we got, the individual mechanic for that story, we started thinking about, okay, where does this go to? And, a huge amount of what the player is going to take away from it, comes down to the last, 5 or 10 seconds. So I think there are a lot of prototypes that we made where, even though the mechanics were interesting, and we felt like aesthetically it was going to be really solid, we just couldn't think of an ending that was going to be very satisfying. So they ended up getting scrapped just because they didn't fit.
Which can you share any of the vignettes that were scrapped of those? Like, what were the kind of the base inspirations for those?
Yeah, so like one of them that I think aesthetically would have been really strong was a story about mountain biking at night through a forest down a hill and kind of weaving through the trees with your flashlight. And I think it's just like an inherently beautiful, kind of primal, frightening scene. But we just can never figure out like what's at the bottom of that hill. Like where do you build from that point? And how do you tell a story there? Like it was just too active. Or like on the flip side, we had a story that I still really wish we could have figured out an answer to about being stuck in an infinite parking garage. And, like that one doesn't have like quite enough for you to do. I mean, we were thinking about maybe like you're in a wheelchair or maybe there's like some other, entity there with you. But I mean, I just really liked that conceptually, being in a kind of infinite space that's also so banal. That one obviously comes from Borges's short story, The Library, which is another, like, Borges is a big inspiration for this game, and I wanted to get something that felt like, very directly inspired by that, but, we just couldn't think of an ending or really, like, much of a story beyond, an exciting premise.
That actually reminds me of there's a Seinfeld episode where they get lost in a garage. That's not as sophisticated, you might say.
I wanted to ask if Edward Gorey was an influence on you guys at all, because I was playing it, and after the first couple stories, I was like, is this just the Ghastly Crumb Tinies? Like,
actually, Ghastly Crumb Tinies definitely was, like a big reference point when we were talking to Sony about the game early on.
Yeah.
I think Edward Gorey is a slightly difficult reference for me because I think I really like Edward Gorey. Like we've got all of his books and I look at them, periodically, but I feel like for most people when they think about Edward Gorey, there is a distance from the characters. It becomes something, and I think Lemony Snicket is very similar, where it's dealing with the macabre, but it's kind of, you're at arm's length from it and it becomes ridiculous and comedic and it loses a bit of its power. And I think that Gorey is a little more complicated. I think that he's not explicitly making a joke about it, but it's easy enough to read it. And certainly, after he's been dead for a number of years, it starts to become, like a little cuter, I guess. It's like the plush Cthulhu's that, like reappropriated in a way. So I really like Edward Gorey. And there's some of that in this game, but I think it's more in love with people like Borges or like Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, or Twilight Zone, or Lovecraft.
I want to remind the people in chat that you're welcome to ask in any questions you might have about Edith Finch or game development and design. So yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what? Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was gonna say if you have a question, I had another question, but we'll let.
I have many questions. Yeah. So when you're making this game, how did you decide on the order of these vignettes and which one was developed first and which one was developed last?
Yeah, so the ordering changed a lot over the course of development. I think for a long time we didn't know which stories were actually going to make the cut. And there was maybe a year ago, kind of private massacre where we got rid of an entire generation of Finches in the interest of chipping the game and also of just kind of consolidating. So, a number of characters kind of became consolidated. Edith's father, Sanjay, used to be like a much more important character, and a lot of his characters, like characterizations, kind of got merged with Edie, actually. And so that was something that, probably about a year ago or so, we had a more or less final idea of the house. And in terms of stories that we started with, Molly's was the first story. Somewhat not surprisingly, I guess. The most technically ambitious, and it's kind of cautionary tale where we were able to do it, but it did take like a crazy amount of production time to create all these different scenes and different control mechanics and different lighting environments and all of that. So it functions, I think, as a really good introduction to the game because it's got so many different elements within it that it sets the stage so that after that you don't expect that these stories are going to be linear contiguous blocks. There's going to be a lot of kind of random nonsense that will be thrown at you. And I think actually the next big story that we did was Lewis's story. We kind of did the two largest stories in the game were the first ones that we tackled, and we learned a lot from them. But I think we also got the sense that these are stories that we probably don't want to do too many of because they take a ton of time. And that's why you don't see other games, that are structured like this, because each of those short stories, even though they only last for a little bit of time, like they all have their own very distinct problems. Like Lewis's story is being rendered onto a cloud. It's like drawn in kind of third person, which meant that we had to have the camera like 2 kilometers away in order to get it to look right. And then all the shadows flicker all the time. So we needed to come up with all these very specific solutions for each of the stories because they were all so different from each other.
You can tell that those two are the ones that took the most amount of time. They're both brilliant. Molly's such a great intro. Especially if you're going into it not knowing what it's all about. It's just like, what am I doing? Why is this happening? and then with Lewis, that's a good one to talk about the mechanics because they're. I don't know. I'm trying to put it into words. It's so unique how you have one thumb doing one routine thing. So you work in a fish factory. Big spoiler here, you work in a fish factory. Yeah, and then you're just moving like this, dun, 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 and you're doing that. And then it's kind of trying to convey, the game's trying to convey, I'm just thinking out loud here, bear with me. So the game is trying to convey routine. And then you have the wandering part of his brain, and that's conveyed on the left thumb. And the left thumb, you start to just use your thumb in such a routine way. At first it feels like patting your head and rubbing your belly, but then it becomes so routine, just how Lewis is at his job, that you're able to do it without thinking. You just start exploring with your left hand. And the way that matched, it made you so empathetic to the character through a standard PlayStation controller. What was it like developing all of that?
I think it's a pretty good microcosm, really, of what the whole game was, which is that as game developers, we start by thinking about it, and we brainstorm stuff, and we find reference art, and we talk about it, and we come up with some ideas that we're really excited about, and lo and behold, just like we did every other time, we make it way, way, way too complicated, and the original version of Lewis's story was it's absurd to think about it now, but there was a boss that was walking around. You had to chop you had to meet a quota, and there was a meter that was showing you how well you were doing, and you could, if you weren't careful, you could chop off fingers, and there was all these resources that you basically had to manage, and a lot of the game was kind of confronting the brutal reality that this was just going to be hard and unnecessary, and that actually, like, there's so much else that's going on in that experience that it was a lot better to make it simpler. So we talked a lot, like, internally about cognitive load, about how much is the player processing right now. And in this game, a lot of what they're actually dealing with isn't even inside the story that they're playing. It's like they're still caught up on the story that they were playing, 10 minutes ago. Or they're wondering about, how this connects to something that they heard an hour ago, that Edith was commenting on. And so we ended up with, it's like we kept simplifying things basically. And to us, it felt like it was way too simple. Like there wasn't enough, to keep players engaged, especially compared to, like a more traditional AAA game. But, there's just, when you put it all together, there's so much that's going on. And, Lewis's story, you have the left and the right stick doing completely different things as well. And it's really hard to gauge how much work that is for players until you have it working pretty well. And then there's something where it's like, it's not quite, it doesn't add up to 1 exactly. It's like 0.4 for each of them, but somehow like that adds up to like 1.0 cognitive load, where, just like the patting your stomach and, tapping your head or whatever, like you can do each of those really easily. But when you put them together, it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's true for the story and true for the game. So, it's a lot of guesswork and guessing wrong over and over again, and just doing play tests and watching people to figure out like what the game actually feels like. Because as a developer, it's just like it's hopelessly lost to you. Like you have an idea of what the game is, but you've kind of seen it since its infancy, so you're just like way too close to it. Mm-hmm. And for us, we just need to have other people experience it and then kind of try to see it through their eyes.
I have 2 questions, and they both relate to sort of game production a bit. The first is a silly one. The second is more serious. The first one I want to ask is, how did you guys get the Halloween theme?
We just asked. Yeah, I mean, it was something that I put in as temp music for, like from the very beginning, basically, the prototype. Yeah. And I've been listening to a bunch of John Carpenter music kind of on repeat while we were working on the story, just like get in the mood. And I was like, this would be really nice if we could get, the real, song. And it was actually not that hard. I mean, there's some things where, it turns out to be impossible, and other things where it just turns out to be like, oh, you just call this person and then like they have a standard fee. And, I think John Carpenter was just like cool about it. And yeah, we're really happy that it worked out. We actually wanted to get John Carpenter himself to do a voiceover, but then there was a SAG strike. So, our options for VO talent was a little bit more limited.
Oh man, did the SAG strike hit you? Because was all the voice recorded before the SAG strike then?
I think we were 1 day into our recording when the SAG strike happened. So yeah, we had to recast everybody. It was unpleasant, but it worked out ultimately.
Wow, that's wild. Like, we think of the SAG strike of hitting large AAA games, but it I guess it's unfortunate that it hit you guys too. But I don't think we have time to get into the nuances of strikes and unions and voice acting right now. But I'm sorry to hear that it just forced you into that corner like that.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, we had a really good casting agent, and she was able to, find a whole bunch of other non-union folks. And yeah.
And hey, it helps new people get work. My next question was going to be, this house that you're exploring, the Finch's house, is extraordinarily detailed. There are a million different objects in every room that tell you about kind of the people before you even get inside their own heads. And at first, it's sort of like you sort of get this thrown at you when you enter the first floor, and there's just the kitchen, the living room, all these areas have these huge environments that it's sort of familiar if you've played these first-person narrative experiences before. But there's also, but then as you keep going through the house, there's this incessant load of objects. How hard was that to create? Because now that I've recently learned more about 3D modeling and how many like in the fine detail in all these objects, because you can zoom in on them. You can read book titles, and there's actual books in there. You can read like the fine detail must have been a huge technical load too, despite being so banal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest technical hurdle for us was just being able to stream everything, so that as you're wandering around the house, like on the PlayStation 4 with its relatively slow hard drive, like being able to load all of that at once. But in terms of the artistic side of things, the approach that we had was somewhat similar to the stories, where we just kept trying different things, and a lot of these spaces went through a lot of different revisions, but you kind of accreted things over time. So the goal had always been to have the house feel like kind of organic entity. And there's this tipping point when you look at, for example, like clutter on a wall, where it goes from being it feels like very clean and sort of almost like it's like the house is about to be sold by a real estate agent, but then when there's sufficient clutter, it starts to feel almost like a fungus or something that's like like an organic entity that's overwhelmed the space. So the goal there was to make the house feel slightly overwhelming. And because we've got 13 different characters in the game, and because we were working on this game for 4.5 years, we actually had a lot of things to draw from. So we got to a point later in production where it wasn't hard for us to fill all of these spaces. Like we already had 13 characters we basically needed to service. Like we wanted to call out, especially in the first and second floor common areas, to kind of call out little bits of foreshadowing for each of the characters, which I think combines to give the game like a kind of lived-in feel, and like there's a history to it, because there actually is like a pretty long development history. Like all these different versions that we went through, and all these different props that we had to model, for other stories, that can get repurposed.
What were some of the other? I got a couple questions that just like eat me up here. But first, the technical aspects of it. You had mentioned the slower PlayStation hard drive. What were some of the other technical challenges? You're talking about earlier in Lewis's story when you've got all this stuff going on. Can you kind of speak to that? Were there any like more notable tech challenges that you had with this game?
Yeah, I mean, they were very different from our last game, where we were concerned about megabytes or like kilobytes, really, on Unfinished Swan, of like how much space we had on the hard drive or in RAM to load. So we were just like going through all the areas and trimming tiny bits. This time around, we didn't have those kind of problems, but we did have I think a lot of just kind of scale issues of like it would take us something like 8 hours to do or actually maybe like a whole day to basically bake the game, and do all of the lighting on that. So kind of building out those tools, and Unreal Engine's really powerful, but it wasn't really designed to do the kind of things we were trying to do. So like, for example, having one space that, is lit at different times of the day is just not something that Unreal supports, really. So we had to roll all of our own technology for handling these different areas with the different lighting that they might have. I think Unreal expects that you'll have one area and you'll bake the lights on it, and that's it. But we had the same areas in day and night, so we need to come up with a solution for that. And I think we spent the most time probably on the just like the streaming stuff. To be able to support having all of these different areas that are preloaded ahead of time. So like when you come into Molly's room, we're already preloading, like the first area of Molly's story, so that, when you open the book up, it's ready to go. So kind of identifying what the next area is going to be was a challenge. The transitions were also, now that I think about it, just a massive pain in the ass. Each one of the transitions, like into and out of stories, was its own unique nightmare. And we had a wonderful gameplay programmer, Evan Rogers, who at the end of the project, he and Chelsea Hash, our tech artist, kind of took it on themselves to fix all these things. And the problem is that like they needed to be kind of pixel perfect because we're fading like from Edith's world into Molly's world, and you've got text that's also generally coming with you. So there were each one of them. I think like Evan found like 3 or 4 different problems that were causing the camera to have like slight hitches where like it was getting updated a little too early in the frame, or like the field of view of the camera was slightly different from the animated camera. And normally those things aren't very noticeable. You just have like a loading screen, that would cover all that up. But because we wanted the game to feel like you're falling down a rabbit hole, it was really important for us that it be seamless, that you just feel like effortlessly flowing in the same way that the controls, are meant to feel effortless, even though there are big jumps. So you're becoming a cat or an owl or whatever, but subconsciously it's relatively easy to pick up because the actual like which buttons and sticks you're using stay the same. That it's kind of remarkable at the end, hopefully, to players that they were able to make through it at all. And so we wanted all these transitions to feel really seamless, but that took a lot of work at the end of the project.
Yeah, I mean, control-wise, if we're talking about Molly's story, for example, it is very intuitive, and as far as the transitions go, that's something that people would take for granted tech-wise, because I mean, it turned out so smooth. I wouldn't, have guessed, though I'm not surprised that there's something in game development that looks like it's simple and that ends up being one of the hardest.
I like how so many guests we bring onto this show will say they'll go just suddenly say something like Unreal Engine was not designed to do that, or Unity was not designed to do that, and we hear that so often here.
Yeah, it's interesting. What people one of the most interesting things about licensed engines is just the things that developers have to do to them, to make them more custom for their studio.
Yeah, and our experience with Unreal was that it was, ultimately very customizable. It take a couple weeks, you're gonna have to roll up your sleeves and get into it, but whatever you want to do is generally possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's either that or make your own entire engine, which isn't really an option for a lot of people these days. So, and another thing too, you had talked about cutting certain things. You said that you basically just like massacred a whole bunch of ideas at one point, which leads me to think that there were some design guidelines or filters that that you were following. So when you're killing your darlings here, what are some of the guidelines where it's just like this has got to go?
I think a lot of it just comes down to a gut feeling about it, and it's sad, but a lot of the stories that work really well from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the stories that are going to be problematic are problematic kind of the whole time. And there's something about them where you feel like, oh, if only, it's like a relationship that you're trying to save, that like, if only we could do this, like one little thing, and like fix it and everything would be good. But it's actually, you're just like, it's sort of like you're on a bicycle, and some stories you're pedaling downhill and other stories you're pedaling uphill. So, sometimes it can be worth it if it's not a very big hill and there's something great to see at the top of it. But, when you have a choice of which story to cut, the ones that feel like the most uphill, I think are the ones that we cut. Where there are kind of problems for art and for animation and design, just kind of bundled together, those were the first to go. Although some stories, like Gregory Story is a great example where, that story started off really great, where we had a prototype that we were really happy with, that we did in Unity, that, Ben Esposito, our design consultant, spent like, maybe a week or two on, and we're like, great, let's go into production on this. And then it was like a year or two of, just slog, where it just like didn't feel right. And a bunch of people took a pass at it. And then finally, right at the end, where we were about to have to cancel the story, Evan Rogers, stepped up and really knocked it out of the park and figured out, how to make the gameplay of that feel really great.
Sorry, can you remind me which one was Gregory's story?
He's the baby.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Oh, yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
God. Yeah. That was that was heavy.
Yeah, the
And it,
thing that the stories are all good at doing is that they just put you kind of in precarious positions. So like you're flying a kite in a storm, stuff like that, or you're a baby in a bathtub. It's like this can go maybe a couple of ways. You're thinking in your brain, and neither of them are like no outcome is going to be good. Um, is that something that you're thinking of, trying to put the players maybe when players are play testing and you're talking to them afterwards, what are they saying about that feeling of being unsafe in these little vignettes?
Yeah, I mean, I think Gregory's story is one that the response we got from playtesters was very different depending on if they'd played it in isolation or if they played it as part of like a complete game playthrough. So, after you've played a number of these stories, when you come to Gregory's story and you realize it's a child in a bathtub, like have a sense of where it's going to go, and that's a big emotional moment. And I think Gregory's story is also interesting because the reactions we saw were very different for players who were parents. There's something about like having a child of your own that has a very significant impact on what your relationship is to the threat, that might be posed to a child. So we tried to get a lot of very different kinds of like people from very different backgrounds to play these stories in playtest, just to see like how it resonated with people. And it even today, like you can see reviews of the game that are quite divergent, where one person will say it was like an incredibly emotional experience for them, that after they finish the game they need to spend 15 minutes like just like looking at the wall to recover. And then other people are like, oh, this game is too short and there are no collectibles, and that were kind of like confusing. And then they're just like on to Outlast 2 or whatever, they're playing this game. And it's nice that the game doesn't require people to care about all of that. I mean, we did explicitly try to make something where, you don't need to be someone who cares about story to engage with this thing. And then hopefully, there's enough in this world that over time you will become curious about these people and, give a little bit of yourself to it. But, some people don't, and that's fine.
I have a question, and this is one. I'm not trying to ask for your hard canon answer on this, but rather I'm curious as to how you think about it. Early in the game, characters begin sort of talk about the curse not just as like a series of unfortunate events, but rather as a physical entity that may be haunting the family. Like there's sort of some connections between between some of the characters, like where that I think opens with the creature that's under Molly's bed, and then characters, and they never like quite come so far as saying like there is a creature stalking this family, but you sort of get the sense that maybe there's a actual supernatural force at play here. But that I'm trying not to reach too hard back into my stupid like liberal arts education, but everything from magical realism to whoa, what was that? To these other things that means that there isn't necessarily an actual creature haunting them, or that any of these stories happened the way you're experiencing them because you're getting them from someone else's perspective. How did you sort of like? But video games haven't quite spent enough time in a space where there either is or isn't something going on. How did you sort of navigate that line as a designer, trying to decide where you show something explicitly attacking the player, or someone, I should say, versus other moments where there's sort of unfortunate coincidences that stumble together?
Can you rephrase that? Like, what is that?
Sorry. Okay. Like what it sounds like I'm asking is there a monster? Is there magic or is there not? And what I really want to know is, in your own head, how did you sort of live on a day-to-day basis thinking about your own game? Am I telling the story of a family that was attacked by monsters, or am I telling the story of a bunch of people's death and how other people connected them together?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the attitude we had changed over the course of development. So
Yeah.
early on, it was much more of like a literal magic.
Yeah.
So prototypes for like how Edith might cast spells, for example, like combining letters in the world into like phrases and things. And the game sort of diverged from that, and we put the magical elements of it more into the stories and less into kind of real world. So, I think for me, it still feels like that's a possibility that maybe in Edith's world, there are these magical elements, that magic is something, that exists in that space. I think based on what I've, heard from players playing the finished game, there's a sense that they don't feel like they really believed that that was possible in that world, that there's this dichotomy between the real world and the magical side of things. So, I think in some ways, like, they're playing a different game from the one that we sort of imagined it might be. But a lot of this goes back to like weird fiction as a reference, and the idea that in those stories, like, you never get to know the truth. Like, there is no objective reality. It's just different people's interpretation of it. And the game is about a lot of different things, but one of the things it's about is stories, and the way that as Edith, as the player, you're hearing Edith's version of events, like as she's describing other people's versions of events, and there's a lot of ways that can get distorted, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so we're trying to invite the player to have to piece these things together themselves, knowing at the same time that there is no right answer. And I think it's a little confusing because when players, I think maybe other games have trained them this way, or it's just like a personality, orientation. When they're confronted with a mystery, there's a sense that, okay, by the time the credits roll, I will have solved the mystery. And that's not really what this game is. Like, this game is more about, like, how do we confront the unknown? What does that feel like to come up against a universe that is stranger than I can imagine? Because that's kind of how I personally see the world, is something that we're never going to be, like, we are incapable of understanding the universe fully, and the best we can do, is try to, make a kind of peace with it and, have a relationship with the universe, but we can't, solve it.
That is the exact feeling that I got from the game. I mean, it's just it's unresolved, and I like that because it's true. People play a lot of video games. Like, I can include myself here. They want that kind of happily ever after, or the universe was saved or destroyed or whatever. But it's nice. It's kind of like, I think that's one of the reasons too that people, by the end of it, it really affected some people, because it gives you like a bit of a, I wouldn't necessarily, for me, it wasn't like a feeling of existential crisis, but it was a feeling of, well, exactly what you just said. Like, just, here we are, and, make peace with the universe, and you can't control everything, in your life. Yeah.
I think in hindsight, we could have done a better job of letting people know that they shouldn't be expecting an answer. That's partly our bad that we didn't, signpost that as clearly as we could have. But, for us, like, the game isn't really about telling a particular story. It's more about creating spaces, and interesting situations for people to think about. And people enjoy that opportunity to kind of reflect on their own existence and the universe and games and stories and all these things. And, other people are less interested in that. But again, hopefully, the game doesn't force people to do that. It's just like one of the many things that is there if people want to embrace it.
You're going to hate me, but I'm going to ask for a clarification, because a couple of minutes ago you said we were trying to tell a set of stories, or something to that effect, and then in the last sentence you said we weren't trying to You said something that sounded a little contradictory to that, which is that we weren't trying to hammer home. I don't know. Now I'm like mangling the words as I'm saying that. But do you follow me?
Yeah, no, and I think there's some confusion about names in this case. Like, what is a game? What is a story?
Oh my god.
But I would say, like, the primary focus for us was not plot or even necessarily character development. It was getting players. It was an experience. Like, the way I look at it is each of these short stories is kind of a pathway that leads you to an experience, but it's not so much about like this person betraying that person or like the intrigue among characters in the way that House of Cards, for example, might be more about kind of the plot and the story in that sense. Like, even though I think it's fair to describe this as a game, like a story game, and it's certainly interested in stories like in the way that they twist reality. I think for me it's less about like the plot part of the story as it is about creating an experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're starting to run out of time on. I want to get this thing. So we're already kind of touching on this, the reception of the game and how people have been interpreting it or reviewing it and whatnot. So what's it like for you to launch something that has such heavy artistic leanings, that's doing something like pretty unique in video games? What's it like releasing that into a like kind of commercial market?
It's very strange to have something that was so secretive for so long. That was only something that we were seeing that now is so out there. Like, to be able to go on Twitch and watch dozens of different people play through the game has been strangely compelling. I think there's a Wim Wenders film, Until the End of the World, where people are able to like watch their own dreams, and everyone gets kind of obsessed with watching their own dreams. And that's kind of what it feels like right now, to be able to watch people's reactions to the game. And I think it's been just broadly really encouraging that so many people are willing to engage emotionally with the game. Because we saw a ton of different people playtest the game early on, and if you are not interested in being kind of emotionally open and really like thinking about these things and how they relate to your own life, then the game has things for you, but it's not going to be something that is kind of transformative or really memorable or personal. But it's been really encouraging to see how many people in 2017, when they sit down with a controller in their hand, are actually like really emotionally open and available. Even though a lot of us have been playing games for 30 years, like we kind of sit down as if it's in some ways the first time, and are giving part of ourselves to the game to see what happens.
Do you think that'll continue to like improve as time goes on, that people will have different expectations from games, that it's not always going to that you're going to get something like Edith Finch?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem in some ways. Whenever there's a very new thing, like I think weird fiction is a great example of that, where the stuff that I'm really interested in, like that was being written in the 1930s, say like H.P. Lovecraft, eventually that transforms into like a genre of horror. And once something becomes a genre, it's a little easier to promote, and people can identify themselves as like, oh, I'm a big fan of horror. But it also loses a bit of its mystery, and becomes kind of calcified, and it's got rules and expectations. And so I don't know. It's I think we're at a point now where there's this idea of a walking simulator, and that's a pretty broad description of it, which is kind of fun, because you can go in with some expectations, but it's okay if you completely throw those expectations out. So, I think in some ways it's positive, but then, there's also a danger that these kind of things over time will kind of naturally tend to, the way that like early real-time strategy games felt like there was a ton of experimentation. Even something like, what was the shiny RTS that was also like a, third-person action game, Sacrifice? There's like weird experiments.
Yeah.
But then it sort of calcifies into, like expectations that people have about what an RTS is or isn't. So yeah, I don't know. It's great that there's so many people right now, at least, who are still really trying bizarre things.
Yeah. I think that we need to wrap it up.
May they?
I could talk to you like, maybe we can end on this. And if someone's going to ask you, if an aspiring game developer or like a seasoned one who wants to do something that conveys story, I don't know if you want to call it storytelling or what, getting somebody in a certain headspace like Edith Finch does. And they ask you for like general kind of advice to help them tell a better story in a game. What would you say?
I guess I would say start with something very specific, because it's easy when you're having these ideas to have a lot of them and they're kind of all over the place. But if you can hone in on what it is that really moves you. If it's something, like in Edith Finch, for example, like the feeling of being on the beach as a kid flying a kite. It's like you've got a touchstone you can come back to, and you can start to evaluate all the different ideas and say, like, well, does this serve that goal or not? Because, as game developers, I think it's very easy to add features or add things and add ideas. And it's hard to say like what should or should not be part of this. So the more concrete, specific you have, from the beginning, and I think it helps to be something kind of small. Like if it's too elaborate, then you've kind of boxed yourself in already. But if it's something that's just this like little seed crystal, then there's enough room for the process to kind of find its own way, and sort of like jazz, where people are sort of improvising off of that, but starting from a common base. So yeah, I guess at a broad level, that's what I would say. And in terms of like actually the production realities of making, these things come to life, the biggest piece of advice I would say is to, learn a bunch of different tools, like things like, Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop or Maya for 3D animation, or like a little bit of programming to be able to like make little prototypes. Because the biggest challenge is when you're working with a team, like how do you communicate these ideas and how do you yourself kind of explore them so that, you can learn what it is that really interests you. And the more ways you can express that, the easier it is for you to like have a conversation with an animator or an artist and like talk to them in their language and make really, really shitty versions. But it's amazing how clear it is to an artist when you just like cobble together a bunch of reference photos into, an image of kind of what you want it to be. It's like everybody on the team is speaking a different language, and the closer you can get to their language, the better that communication will be.
That is excellent advice, and I think an excellent place to stop our stream.
Yeah. I can't believe it's already time to wrap things up, but I will start
that went
wrapping
fast.
things up.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone who joined us today to talk about What Remains of Edith Finch. The game is out now on PS4 and PC, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can pick it up there. We highly encourage you to check it out. This game, I can only speak for myself when I say this game got me to think about the unease of how things will be. Are we going to be okay? That's my personal quick reaction, but I think I'm so glad that Ian and the rest of the Giant Sparrow team were able to make something like that. So if for us at Gamasutra, we would also super appreciate it if you clicked the follow button that's somewhere on your Twitch page right now, because if you follow us, we can get you more interviews with great developers like Ian to talk about their games, their work, their life in the game industry. Chris is here, is doing the Microsoft HoloLens interface with Twitch.
I was trying to point at the follow.
Yeah. But yeah, Ian, thanks so much for joining us. And what's next for you? You're gonna take a nice vacation now that you're done shipping this game?
Probably I'll take a couple weeks off. What I find is that after about 2 or 3 weeks, I kind of need some projects to work on.
Yeah.
But I think actually for me, I'm going to go to become an animator. So for the next 2 years, I'm going to go back to school and learn animation, because the next project is going to be very animation focused. So I just want to be able to again, like, speak in the native language of animators and be able to like animate my own terrible little prototypes, just to kind of communicate that to myself and the rest of the team.
Right on.
So a little vacation of sorts. But
right. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and bye.
Bye.